Hello, and welcome to my second lore video for Vampire the Masquerade Bloodhunt. This time I wanted to focus on the history of Prague, as this information comes from many different editions of the game, and even different mediums for Vampire the Masquerade, and as the series is notorious for having an unreliable narrator, some of this information will be a little disjointed. In the case of the video game Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, there is also the caveat of characters being made for the game after some of the lore had been previously established. This resulted in some inconsistencies with the world and the time period the game was set in. Most of it has been retconned to an appropriate date that clears most of it up. Those who have some knowledge of Redemption or Vampire the Dark Ages will find that I did combine some of the info from these sources. I decided to do it in this manner to make the information as comprehensive as possible. There are many interesting tales that originate from this area, and some may even present possible story hooks that Shark Mob could carry forward and use within Bloodhunt as the in-game story progresses. Due to the length I ended up with, and with Act 2 of Bloodhunt releasing, I've decided to split the video into two parts for ease of viewing. This will also allow me to add any relevant information to Part 2 that may be learned about in the new lore added to the recent patch. The first part will cover early history up through the 17th century, with more modern events being covered in the second video. Many groups of mortals had previously settled in the area that would become Prague, but the city's history truly begins with the arrival of a Western Slavic tribe in the 7th century. Led by the powerful Shagra and her charismatic granddaughter Libusha, we start with the story of how they came to this new land to understand the source of the forces that shaped Prague for centuries to come. Shagra, war leader and shaman of the Slavic tribe known as the Vroi, drove her people west to free them from the servitude of a larger tribe. They ultimately passed into the land of an ancient Samici, Vukadlak, whom they served for a time. In the mid-2nd century, the ancient lord rewarded Shagra for her service by embracing her, binding her to him with a blood oath, and sending her out to claim new lands for him. She made a ghoul of her granddaughter, Libusha, and passed the leadership of her tribe on to her. It should be noted that in their original sources, Vukadlak from Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, and Shagra from Transylvania by Night, are often seen as mutually exclusive, and it is theorized that Vukadlak was in fact based on the character of Shagra. However, upon researching these two characters, I found that their stories fit almost seamlessly together if it is assumed that Vukadlak is Shagra's ancient Zavici sire, and chose to present the story in this manner for the sake of consistency, as neither character directly conflicts with the other. Vukadlak, Scourge of the Carpathians, Smiter of the Lesser Clans, Slayer of Lupines, was rumored to have existed before the biblical flood known in Vampire the Masquerade as the Deluge. He sought great power and wanted to elevate himself to the level of the antediluvians through diablerie. During the 6th century, he was summarily struck down with a curse and placed into torpor that was meant to last 20 centuries by the Voivode Council, the rulers of Clan Zamici. He was stripped of all lands and titles, and his servants were purged. Despite the attempted eradication, some of his servants survived, including his childer Shagra and her ghoul granddaughter and leader of the Vroi, Libusha. Though the blood oath had long since fallen to a distant memory, Shagra nonetheless sensed the fall of her sire and returned to him. Together they led their tribe and the remnants of Vukadlak's servants across Europe, ravaging villages and embracing more into their fold, all the while carrying his body. They eventually settled in Bohemia, in an area that would ultimately become the city of Prague. Libusha, recognizing that her people tired of her leadership, took a common plowman named Premisil as her husband and handed the rule of her people to him. Libusha eventually faked her own death, allowing her to continue to serve her grandmother and the sleeping Vukadlak in secret. The construction of Prague Castle began in the late 9th century and would become the resting place of Shagra, who slipped into a torpor over time. In the early 10th century, work began on a second fortification, ultimately known as Vyšehrad Castle, which became the resting place of Vukadlak. Intermarriage took place between the Premisil family and other noble families who, when proving themselves useful, would be made ghouls. The cross-marriage of these ghouls would eventually result in the Premislid dynasty becoming a powerful revenant family in service to the sleeping Methuselahs, and they sought a way to wake Vukadlak early from his cursed sleep. While Prague itself was held fast by the Zamici, the lands and nearby forests were securely controlled by members of Clan Gangrel, as well as packs of Lupines, both of which sought out and destroyed any Cainite foolish enough to enter their territory. While the Lupines would outright kill any Cainite who dared enter the forest, the Gangrel would capture and feed off any they found, hoping to make themselves stronger in order to one night tear down the walls of the city and reclaim it. After Shagra finally succumbed to torpor, the then ruler of Prague, Duke Wenceslaus I, attempted to throw off his master's yoke. He sought outside help rather than relying on his family to secure his power, paving the way for the Venture's entry into the city. Despite the promise of aid, their true goal was establishing political and economic power. They did nothing to stop Wenceslaus's murder at the hands of his brother, Boleslav I, only a few years later. The founding of the Bishopric of Prague by Boleslav II late in the century opened the doors for yet more Cainites to enter the city, specifically the Toreador and Lasombra clans as they vied for power within the church. Not long after arriving in the city, the Ventru finally rose to power. Rudolf Brandl claimed the title of Prince of Prague, though his leadership was hardly secure. He was often reliant upon the goodwill of the Przemysl family. He was forced into a puppet-like position, unable to afford antagonizing the Zamici in the city without risking losing his position. He had suspicions about what lay beneath Vyšehrad Castle, as the Przemysl had asked that he decree Vyšehrad off-limits to other Cainites. He eventually offered an alliance to the Toreador in the city, which allowed Bohemia to stay within the Holy Roman Empire and simultaneously allowed the Toreador to push the Lasombra out of the regional church. Around this time, practitioners of magic also began to arrive in the city, hoping for protection from persecution. Drawn by the presence of Kabbalists and Jewish scholars, this naturally drew the presence of the newly formed clan Tremere, as well as clans Nosferatu and Cappadocian, who found a home in the Jewish quarter and Little quarter of the city, respectively. In the early 12th century, the great University of Prague was built, financed by the Ventru prince. It became a great center for learning, and led members of the Bruja clan to the city, seeking to spread their philosophies to new lands. Near the end of the 12th century, the servants of Vukodlak began to finalize their plans for awakening their master. However, the machinations of the Bruja Ekaterina the Wise culminated in the destruction of Vyšehrad Castle on the eve of Vukodlak's attempted awakening. The assault of the castle was comprised of both kindred and kind alike, seeing the Bruja, Cappadocians, Tremere, and Ventru aligned against the schemes of the Zamici. The chaos of this night also saw the death of Prince Rudolf Brandl at the hands of Joseph Zvi, a Nosferatu who had been at odds with the prince for some time over the Jewish quarter of the city. Brandl had sent ghoul assassins after the Nosferatu in an attempt to eliminate him while he slept. However, Zvi, wise to the prince's plans, was not in his usual resting place. Instead, he maintained consciousness during the day and used the myriad tunnels beneath Prague to enter the prince's haven and slay him before he rose early that evening. Zvi would ultimately claim the title of prince for himself, reaching an accommodation with the Przemysl and gaining support from Ekaterina and the Bruja along with the Cappadocians. Though a victory in the short term, the bolstering of the mortals against vampires would be a key element that brought on the rise of the Inquisition, which would eventually put the lives of all kindred in serious danger. The loss of the Zamici stronghold of Vyšehrad and the empowerment of the kind led to the scion of the Przemysl family and the first king of Bohemia, Ottokar I, to minimize his involvement with Libusha and the torpid Chagra. Within the first decade of Zvi's rule, Chagra began to awaken. In her advanced age and extreme hunger, only Cainite blood would suffice to satisfy her thirst, and vampires began disappearing. Most notably among them a number of visiting Tremere. Arden of the Golden Lane insisted on a full investigation. Zvi set out to the task of learning the source of the disappearances, resulting in Joseph eventually stumbling upon Chagra. Though a power struggle ensued between the two for a number of years, the Nosferatu was able to eventually coax the Zamici back into torpor, keeping her fed both with vitae and subtly misleading information. Despite the efforts on the night Vyšehrad Castle was sacked, and unknown to most, Vukodlak survived the destruction of Vyšehrad Castle. Over the next few centuries, Vukodlak's minions attempted further resurrections of their master. The plans were always waylaid by the secret efforts of the ghoul Anezka, working to postpone his resurrection for as long as possible. Though this time period was relatively uneventful, a couple key events did occur. Namely, during the reign of Emperor Sigismund in the first half of the 15th century, Kokorin Castle, roughly 39 miles north of Prague, was deeded to the Zamici lord Janek Rytka. Janek retained and resided in the castle throughout the centuries, claiming the title of Voivode of Kokorin. During the time of the Habsburg monarchy, Clan Toreador gained prominence in the region and secured a firm grip on the area. This situated them as one of the most prominent clans in the region, even in modern nights. There is a seemingly calm stretch of time that occurs after this point, and this is where we will conclude the first part of Prague's history. Part 2 will consist of the 20th and 21st centuries, where things really start to get interesting. Join me next time, where we will encounter the fiery conclusion of Joseph Zvi's long reign as prince, and see the ruling position of Prague change hands multiple times over the course of a relatively brief period.